In the short time since oil was discovered here, this unforgiving Arctic desert has undergone astonishing changes. Billions of dollars have been invested in this project, the largest ever undertaken by private industry. Until mid-1975, activities were centered at the drill sites scattered over a relatively small area of the vast Arctic bleakness, reaching deep for the wealth of crude that will help eliminate much of America's dependence on foreign oil, and along the course of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, now under construction. But as the pipeline nears completion, oil men must look to the means of linking the scattered wellheads into the big 48-inch diameter line. Gathering lines, separating plants, flow stations, compressor plants, power plants, and other facilities must all be constructed and put into operation. The pressure of time generated by the impending energy crisis and the difficulties of the harsh environment led to the possibility of prefabricating these facilities in massive modular units in the lower 48 states that could then be fit together like gigantic building blocks at Prudhoe Bay. One big question remained. Once assembled, could these massive modules be transported to the North Slope? The cargo experts of Arctic Marine Freighters, a Crowley Maritime Corporation subsidiary, were called in. These marine transportation specialists had successfully delivered some 450,000 tons of cargo during 7 previous sea lifts to the North Slope. After researching the unprecedented problem posed by these giant lifts, oil companies and Arctic Marine Freighters agreed it could be done. The solution called for the utilization of huge crawler transporters, like those used by NASA in the space program, and the versatile combination of tug and extremely large barges. With a positive transportation solution agreed upon, construction began immediately at Seattle, Tacoma, and Everett, Washington, Sacramento, California, and Houston, Texas. The module's interiors are complete in every respect, including all wiring, ducting, and heating. All the necessary equipment for operation is installed before shipment, including the intricate and sophisticated control rooms. Now it was up to Arctic Marine Freighters. The key to the plan was in making the barge secure and stationary so it can accept the enormous weight of the module as it is transferred from the dock. The barges, many larger than a football field, were positioned at the construction sites. In Seattle, a graving dock was used so the water could be locked out during the loading, then refilled to float the loaded barges. This enables the barge to rest solidly on the graving dock bottom during loading operations. In shallower waters at Tacoma, the barges were ballasted until resting on the waterway bottom during high tide as well as low tide. Next would come the delicate operation of transporting the 179 modules from the construction sites to the barge decks. Some modules were rolled onto the barges using rubber-tired dollies. Rigging contractors walked the biggest modules onto the barges by crawler transporters. The crawlers, among the largest ever built, weigh the modules, determine their center of gravity, then lift them off the ground and transport them at the speed of 3/4 of a mile per hour. Some of the modules weighed 1,300 tons and were as tall as a 9-story building. As the barges were loaded and the cargo secured, they were refloated and placed in storage docks until departure. When dock space became available, Empty barges were moved into position, and the loading process proceeds.
We're going to use that for a spring as we go ahead. They can move it ahead if they want.
Meanwhile, at Houston, Texas, a gigantic compressor plant unit was loaded onto a waiting barge by crawler transporters. With time growing short, the loading schedule was critical. Back in Seattle, some 40,000 tons of general cargo was being loaded aboard an additional 21 barges. After 7 years of supplying the oil industry in the Arctic with such hoist-on cargo, this phase of the operation was almost routine. The loading was complete. 47 barges loaded with 160,000 tons of cargo. The modules loaded on 26 barges formed a floating city of steel, ready to be assembled at Prudhoe Bay. In Houston, the loaded barge was towed through the Houston waterway, starting its 10,000-mile trip to Prudhoe Bay via the Panama Canal, where the huge barge is almost too much for the narrow channel. The big barge is towed through the canal locks by donkey engines to the Pacific Ocean to begin the long trek north to the Arctic. Leaving Puget Sound on schedule, the flotilla began its 3,500-mile voyage to Prudhoe Bay. The Armada would rendezvous with the Houston, Long Beach, and Sacramento tows en route, making a total of 47 barges and 23 tugs. The charted route crosses the Gulf of Alaska, knifing through the Aleutian Chain at Unimak Pass into the Bering Sea. Then, through the Bering Strait, in sight of Siberia, into the Chukchi Sea, and on to Barrow. After a 3-week voyage, the fleet arrived southwest of Point Barrow on July 25th, a week early by design. The early arrival would give the fleet a chance to regroup and prepare for the final 150-mile run through the Arctic Ocean to Prudhoe Bay. As expected, the ice floe at Barrow blocking the route would prevent the sea lift from continuing for a few days. However, the ice was unusually heavy. Historically, the ice off Barrow has opened around August 2nd and remained open about 6 weeks, allowing time to get to Prudhoe Bay, discharge the cargo, and return past Barrow before the winter freeze sets in, blocking passage for another year. A company plane flies continual reconnaissance, watching the floe for opening channels that would allow the fleet to slip through. Patiently, the fleet waits. August 4th, the ice floe still holds fast.
But I think we're looking at another 2-3 days optimistically right now.
August 12th. As far as the eye can see, ice. No break in the pattern. No one in the fleet is aware that they are about to experience the worst Arctic ice conditions in this century. As ice conditions worsen, the fleet is forced to retreat south of Wainwright, almost 100 miles below Barrow, to escape an ice lock-in. In previous years, the ice pack moved out predictably, allowing the tows to slip through open channels. Upon arrival at Prudhoe Bay, shoreside crews could discharge the vital cargo on a clockwork schedule. This year, the cargo crews wait at Prudhoe Bay, with little to occupy their time. Feeding the cocky ground squirrels was a far cry from building a pipeline. Serene and unconcerned caribou roam the sights as landside crews wait in frustration. August 20th. Now, off the tiny Eskimo village of Wainwright, the fleet waits, time growing short. The beauty of the never-setting midnight sun on the ice was wasted on the tug crews as they too waited, fighting off that relentless enemy, monotony.
Well, it's about time. Let's see. Today's Saturday.
The wary polar bears launched a curious investigation, even boarding a barge on one occasion. The constant search for a break in the ice goes on, but luck had abandoned the fleet. Hemmed in between ice and a dangerously shallow shoreline, the unprotected fleet was hit by the full fury of a dreaded Arctic storm, buffeted for 3 days, the heavily laden barges tossing like corks in gale-force winds. The storm took its toll. 4 barges broke loose and were blown onto the beach. 3 of the barges were quickly refloated, their cargo undamaged. The 4th barge was not so lucky. The tremendous force of the ice tore gaping holes in the hull. A major salvage operation was immediately launched to rectify the situation. The damaged barge was refloated, and all the cargo was saved. The storm pushed the ice floe tightly around the tows before they could retreat further, locking them in. Hope for the normal opening in the ice grew very slim indeed. Finally, on September 2nd, the ice recon team spotted a small lead in the ice, and the decision was quickly made to send 10 of the barges through. But the going was slow. Experienced captains on the tugs wove their way through the ice floes, watching carefully for grounded icebergs that could crumple a steel hull. As suddenly as the ice had opened, it closed again, trapping several of the tows. The lead tows continued on to Prudhoe Bay in their race against the ice, dropping off their barges and then returning to help the tows still trapped in the frozen sea. Finally, breaking loose, the tows push on. What started out to be a short voyage between Point Barrow and Prudhoe Bay had turned into a harrowing trip of 5 days. But all 10 of the barges arrived safely at their destination, where shoreside crews immediately began discharge operations. Now, the years of experience behind Arctic Marine freighters' personnel paid off, as the original unloading plans, based on arrival of the entire flotilla, had to be scrapped and alternate plans hastily improvised and executed. At dockside, the loaded barges were sunk by ballasting in the shallow water, making them secure on the bottom for offloading their heavy modules. The modules were transported inland and deposited on storage pads, later to be moved to their final sites. The enormous amount of tonnage and the variety of cargo was offloaded by shoreside crews with phenomenal dispatch. After delivering their cargo, the crawler transporters were trucked back to the dock for their next load. The 10 tugs returned without their barges to assist the rest of the fleet, still waiting off Wainwright, only to find the conditions had worsened. At the Eskimo village of Barrow, the natives were experiencing the worst conditions in a generation and no relief in sight. This was their summer. Hard decisions were now at hand. Wait for next year or stand by to make a hazardous run through the worst ice conditions since 1898. As the Sealift faced risks never before experienced, decisions to continue would have to be made jointly with the oil companies involved. Executives of Crowley Maritime Corporation's offshore division, ARCO, Exxon, and BP Alaska Incorporated met at Prudhoe Bay to discuss the situation. The first step was to examine ice conditions firsthand in the ice recon plane. Then the crucial decision would have to be made on a day-to-day basis. The fleet made several attempts to advance, only to be rebuffed by worsening ice conditions. The 21 general cargo barges were rerouted to Seward, Alaska, so that their loads could be carried overland to Prudhoe Bay. The modules on the 15 remaining barges could only be delivered by barge, and only a miracle would allow them to get into Prudhoe. Finally, on September 27th, the miracle arrived. The huge ice floes swung back offshore, leaving only a thin hinge of ice between the flotilla and open water to Prudhoe Bay. The tows assembled behind Coast Guard icebreakers mobilized for the operation. After the icebreakers punched a hole through the strip of ice, remaining currents of water rushed through, allowing the tows to navigate. But the battle with the Arctic elements was not yet over. A sudden temperature drop caused new ice to form on what had been open water. Since the Sealift had never operated this late in the year before, navigation and operation through the new ice, already 4 to 6 inches thick, called for new solutions. By making key operational adjustments, the tows were able to navigate ever so slowly in single file. The swath cut through the new ice looked like a modern freeway over a barren desert. But after 24 hours, suddenly pressure from ice floe movements began to force the new ice into thicker floes, slowing progress until finally all of the tows ground to a halt. Now, Arctic marine freighters faced another crisis. Could they continue the last 80 miles, or would they be forced to remain trapped for the winter? 2, 3, and sometimes 4 of the most powerful tugs were assigned to a single barge in an effort to break the grip of the new ice. It was a difficult and dangerous operation as the tugs pushed and pulled on the barges to keep them from getting trapped. By a combination of tug power, brute force, and the crew's perseverance, the mission was finally accomplished. On September 29th, the first few tows arrived safely in Prudhoe Bay. After dropping their barges, the tugs immediately returned to assist their sister tows through the ice. By October 2nd, all 15 of the barges had arrived in Prudhoe Bay. The fleet had assumed risks never before experienced and had come out on top. But the job wasn't finished. By now, ice conditions at Prudhoe Bay made discharging operations practically impossible. While Arctic marine freighters' crews hastily went ahead with offloading plans, lighter tugs churned the icy waters to prevent a complete freeze-up so barges could be moved to the dock. The ocean-going tugs, to escape the ever-tightening grip of winter, had returned past Barrow, leaving their barges behind at Prudhoe. Offshore, the barges were grouped together and sunk, making them secure on the bottom for module transfer. The big building sections were then walked aboard lighter barges by the low-profile crawler transporters for the trip to the beach where water depth was less than 6 feet. The lighter barges, resting securely on the bottom by ballasting, are relieved of their cargo under severe conditions. As modules came off the barges, they were transported over the causeways to temporary storage areas on the mainland, awaiting placement in the growing production complex. Lightering of the huge modules had promised to be a delicate operation under ideal conditions. Now, despite the best efforts of lighter tug captains to keep an open waterway to the dock, the relentless grip of the Arctic winter tightened, freezing the barges in tight. Working around the clock, crews had managed to unload most high-priority cargo. Subsequently, a causeway was extended out some 4,300 feet to reach the stranded line haul barges, and all cargo was brought ashore. The lighter tugs, their work finished until the next sea lift in August, were stored on the dock. A monumental job under normal conditions, the Sealift will go down in the annals of marine transportation as the most dramatic in history. Despite the worst Arctic conditions ever faced, confronting risks never before encountered, Arctic marine freighters delivered the massive modules and other cargo required to continue development of the North Slope oil field. Plans for developing and transporting the oil can now continue as scheduled, taking us a step closer toward relief from the energy crisis. But development of the North Slope oil fields is far from finished. More modules are already under construction along the Pacific coast and will be ready for transportation to the North Slope in the summer of 1976. So, more tugs and barges are being built by the Crowley Maritime Corporation to handle the thousands of tons of cargo to be shipped next year and in succeeding years. In July, another sea lift will leave Puget Sound in a repeat performance, hopefully under better conditions. But no matter what happens, Arctic marine freighters will endeavor to be equal to the challenge.